Hello friends, welcome to my bookshelves. This is a very impromptu video. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to come together, but last night I had a desperate urge to rearrange my books. I hope you can tell. It's looking a lot better than it did last time you saw it. Now that it's all neat and tidy, what I want to do is go through, honestly I'm a little bit nervous, and count my books. I want to count the books that I have in each category, and on top of that, I want to take a look at how many I have that are read versus unread. And if you know anything about me, you know that the unread it's probably going to be embarrassing. Why am I doing this? Why am I putting this on the internet? I'm a big mood reader, so I love having a variety of books available to me to pick up, you know, depending on my mood and what I feel like reading at any given time. On top of that, I'm very picky about the books that I keep once I have read them. So I tend to get rid of the vast majority of books once I've read them. So without even counting, I already know that the vast majority of books that I own will be books that are unread. I'm hoping that the percentage isn't too embarrassing though. Like, I'm not gonna have to be shamed off the internet. Only time will tell. So this is my first time separating out into genres aside from just non-fiction and fiction. And because of that, I wanted to keep it nice and simple. So what we have is just fiction, general fiction, literary fiction. There's a little bit of romance in there. Then we have fantasy, sci-fi, speculative. I have a little mystery category, which is honestly smaller than I thought it was going to be, but it's there. Then I also have separated out my collections, so that's short story and poetry collections, anthologies, stuff like that. Then down here is all of the non-fiction, Australian, international, whatever. My manga is still in the same spot, and same for the children's bookshelf out in the living room. I've tidied it up, but its organization remains the same. So that's the brief summary, but this video is not a bookshelf tour. Again, what we're doing is counting my books, and I feel like it's going to take us a little while, so I'm just going to get started. So our first category is the general fiction section. As I mentioned, that's kind of a catch-all for literary fiction, romance, commercial fiction, whatever. And I know there are a handful in here that could kind of cross over into speculative or sci-fi, but like I said, it's pretty vague, and I'm more just thinking about where you're likely to find a book in a bookshop. But anyway, our stats are that I have read 44 of the books that I currently have in my fiction section, and I have 53 remaining on my TBR to be read. So that is a total of 97 books, and I've read 45% of them. Honestly, that's not too bad. I know for some people that will be atrocious or even like an intimidating number. For me, I'm pleasantly surprised. Now on to the fantasy. Rearranging my shelf, I was honestly surprised by how much fantasy I have acquired in such a short time period. I know I've been going pretty hard on the fantasy lately, but I thought it would be about the same, maybe a little bit less than the general fiction section. But nope, it's definitely bigger. It takes up one whole length of the shelf and then another half. To be fair, those fantasy books do tend to be bigger than the fiction books, but that's enough gas bagging. How many have I read? I've read 35 of the fantasy books that I've kept on my shelf. As we spoke about, I've read a lot more fantasy than that. It's just that I haven't wanted to keep those books. There are 99 fantasy books on my shelf that have yet to be read. That's a lot. That's quite a lot. So I have a total of 139 fantasy books, and I've read only 26%. Again, that's a little embarrassing. Am I going to try and justify this to you at all? I suppose the only thing I can say is that obviously fantasy is something that I dove head first into, like a year, 2 years ago, and I definitely did get quite excited in inquiring a bunch of books that I thought I might like or that I wanted to try. And so I bought a lot of books. I bought a lot of books, clearly. I'm not exactly sure how many fantasy books in total that I've read, but I know that I have gotten rid of quite a lot after finishing them. And so this has been a process of me figuring out what it is that I like in fantasy. So while I think these numbers, obviously, they make sense. This is a newer genre that I've gotten into. I'm still going about reading those books. I got a bit too excited at the beginning. I bought a few too many. And I suppose while seeing it out in hard numbers in front of me, it's a little bit shocking and a little bit embarrassing. I'm trying to lean away from the shame though, and just learn from these numbers. And I think the main lesson is that I need to slow down on the acquisition of new fantasy books, which, to be fair, I think I have more recently. I think though, having these numbers in mind will help me slow down even more in the coming months. And I mean, I haven't counted everything yet, but just from looking at it, I think this is the largest category on my shelf, which is really strange to think about. The fact that 2 or 3 years ago, I wasn't really reading fantasy. I really meant it when I said I was in my fantasy era, huh? Okay, next up is the mystery section. As you can see, this section is itty bitty. It's a lot smaller than I even thought it was going to be. I kind of thought in my head I had about 50 mystery books, which is a lot, but it turns out I have 29. I have 29 of them. I have what's here on this shelf, and then I also have the Sherlock Holmes set out on another shelf in the living room. The surprising statistic here though is that I've only read two of those 29 books. Oh. This is the most shameful category, absolutely, without a doubt. Now, to be fair, as with the fantasy, I have read a lot more mystery than that. I haven't kept almost any of them. Honestly, I think this one is going to be a bit of a wake-up call for me. I do kind of think of myself as enjoying a bit of mystery, but clearly I'm still very much at the beginning of that journey and just figuring out what I like, because apparently I don't like a lot of it. Honestly, I didn't even really like the Sherlock Holmes book that I read, which was a bind-up of 2 books. I didn't hate it, but I would not describe that as something that I would want to keep long term. The only reason it's still on my shelf is because I have the whole set. And to make matters worse, the only mystery, thriller, crime book on my shelf that I would say is a book that I love is this one. It's My Sister the Serial Killer. And honestly, this one isn't really even a mystery. This is definitely much more lit-ficky than it is mystery. So this is a category that I definitely need to have a little bit of a personal reflection, honestly, a reckoning with. I am still excited to read those other books on the shelf at the moment that I haven't yet got to. But yeah, these numbers are definitely sobering, to say the least. Okay, with that shame fest out of the way, let's move on to my poetry and short story collections. This is a pretty small section as well. There are 24 books in this little collection that I've got going, and I've read 8 of them, so 33%. There are a handful of them that I've read bits and pieces of, like collections are kind of like that, you can dive in and out of, but as for like finishing the entire book, I've read 8 of them. So 33%, it's not great, but I'll take it after the mystery section. Now let's check out my nonfiction, and honestly, I'm a little bit nervous about this because I feel like I just don't read as much nonfiction these days. So this one could be a little bit embarrassing too. Nonfiction has surprised me. Honestly, I'm feeling pretty good about this one. It's not even 50% and I'm standing here like I've read all of them. There are exactly 100 nonfiction books on my shelf. That's a nice round number, isn't it? And I have read 49 of them. So that's 49%. Nonfiction is definitely one of those categories where I will pick up books based on recommendations that I see online around topics that I'm interested in, or if something's happening in the world or in my life that I kind of feel like I need to learn more about, I'll get a bunch of books on the topic. But they also tend to be books that I don't always read right away unless it feels immediate. So honestly, I'm feeling pretty chuffed that I've read almost 50%. I mean, should I just pick out one more nonfiction book to read before the end of the year so I can say it's 50%? I don't know, I'll see if I can squeeze that in. Now let's take a look at the manga. This is the section I know I did go a little bit overboard with a couple of years ago when I got really excited about manga and trying manga out. So I haven't really been buying much manga in the last, I don't know, I'd say 6 months, because I have a couple of series that I really do want to finish before I start diving into and committing to other series. So honestly, I have no idea how this is going to turn out, but let's count, shall we? Let's find out. Another category I'm feeling pretty good about. I have 115 volumes of manga currently in my collection. Most of them are down on the shelf. I've got some more up top. And then I even have a box set of Full Metal Alchemist in my cupboard. 115 volumes of manga in my collection. I have read 55 of those. So 60 are currently unread, which is a sizable TBR, but that's 48% read. That's not too bad. I know so many of you are sitting there being like, are you kidding? 30 or 40% of your books having been read and the rest unread should not be the standard. And while I agree with you in theory, clearly you and I have different standards. Okay, like I said, we have one more shelf to count, but at least in here, in this room, let's tally up where we're at so far. I have read 209 books that are currently on this shelf, and I have 315 that are unread. So I have a total of 524 books on this shelf and in my cupboard. Let's not forget the cupboard, which means I have read 39% of the books that you see behind me. Honestly, I think in my head, I like the idea of it being closer to 50-50, but equally, I am thrilled that I'm not telling you that it's like 20%, because I genuinely didn't know. I didn't think it was quite that low, but I've never counted these before, so I didn't really know. So 39%. 39%. It's not too bad, but it's not great. I'm not going to stand here and try and convince you that that's a good percentage, but there is something quite cathartic in knowing, in actually knowing. I am definitely starting to have some thoughts about my reading next year and in the coming years, but I will save that till the end. In the meantime, we still have my children's bookshelf out in the living room to count with all of my middle grade, my young adult, and my graphic novels. Well, most of my graphic novels. Some of them are up here if they're like explicitly adult graphic novels. That made them sound dirty. Most of them aren't. There's a couple that are. Okay, are we ready? Are we ready for the children's bookshelf? We got the YA on the top 2 shelves, the middle grade on the next 2, and then we've got some graphic novels down below, which I know you can't quite see yet, but we'll get there. It's looking a little tidier since the last time you saw it. Okay, so young adult. I've read 13 of those books, and there's 34 that remain unread. So there's a total of 49, and I've read 27%, which is pretty low. That's one of our lower percentages. To be fair to myself, young adult is not my favorite. I definitely prefer middle grade to young adult, but I keep picking up proofs and secondhand copies when I come across them because I know I need to read more young adult. So not only have I not read as much young adult as I have middle grade, I think on top of that, I just don't tend to love it when I do read it, so it's pretty rare when I choose to keep it. I think I'll do a little bit better in the middle grade, but I suppose there's only one way to find out. Okay, I feel like I've been redeemed very slightly. There's 38 middle grade books on my shelves currently that I have read. 53 of them though, I have yet to read. So there's 91 middle grade books in total that I have, and I've read 42% of them. Now, while I do tend to prefer middle grade to YA, I still don't keep the vast majority of middle grade that I read or even that I skim through. I feel like this shelf definitely has a much higher turnover, I suppose, than the last shelf, the big shelf. And I'm okay with that. Like, I think as a children's bookseller, that just kind of makes sense. Now, to be fair, this is where I tell you that I'm not counting every single book, because I do have like a couple of picture books and a couple of junior fiction that are just hanging out, but there's not many of them, and I don't think that's very interesting, so I'm just excluding them from this discussion. Now though, I do need to count the graphic novels. The children's and teens graphic novels are on this shelf. My adult graphic novels are on my main shelf. expecting this. I think graphic novels are my most read category. In terms of percentage, that is at least. I have read 16 of the graphic novels that are currently on my shelves, and I have yet to read 13. And you know what that means? I have read more than 50% of my graphic novels. I own 29 graphic novels in total, and I've read 55% of them. I'm so proud of me. The bar really is quite low, isn't it? I love graphic novels, but I don't tend to buy too many of them. I think because they're quite expensive. So where I can, I do tend to borrow them, or every now and then I am lucky enough to get a proof. And I suppose some of my graphic novels, now that I'm thinking about it, might actually be better classed as manga, especially the ones by Jiro Taniguchi, but they're in my graphic novels section. Don't ask me to explain that. Okay, so now that we have counted all of the books, every single book that I currently have in my collection, whether on a shelf or in my cupboard, I have an interesting number of total books. I have 666. I don't know what that says about me. And while that is a huge amount of books, I'm not going to try and pretend that it's not. Honestly, I kind of thought there were more. Like, I have such a big bookshelf here and it is full. And I have read 260 of them. 260 books read in my collection, which is kind of nice. That's 260 books that I love. That's really kind of nice. I like that. But then for the unread, there is 406 unread books. That is a lot. That is a lot. I am someone who reads at reasonably high volumes, although how much I read in a year does definitely fluctuate. Last year I read 250 books. This year I think I'm going to get close to about 120, 130. But even in a pretty solid year, and even if I were only to read the books on my shelves, it would still take me multiple years to get through all of the books that I currently own. But I suppose now is the part where I try and have some thoughtful reflection on this whole situation, on this whole project that we have just completed. Okay, firstly, and I think the most obvious, is the mystery category. Even though I've read a handful of mystery this year, I have only loved one, and it barely even counts as a mystery. So I am usually pretty resistant to hard and fast rules, but I think I need to give myself one. And that is that I cannot buy myself any more mystery books until I have read, let's say, at least 50% of the mystery books that are in that category on my shelf. That might seem low to you, but like, I'm somebody who needs to have like achievable goals. Otherwise, they just stress me out more than anything. So I have to have at least a 50% read ratio for the mystery books that I have on my shelf. And not even so much because I think there's something like inherently horrible about the idea of having a bunch of unread books on your shelf. Obviously, I would be a hypocrite at this point in the video to be professing that. But more importantly, I think it's clear that I don't know what I like in that genre. And so before I go out buying more books, I need to read at least a decent handful of those, or at least try them, and start to get a better sense of what it is I'm looking for before I purchase any more. Now, I think the same thing could be said for the fantasy category. I don't necessarily want to put as strict a rule on the fantasy, at least just yet, because I do feel like I'm at least a little bit further along in that journey. I am starting to get a sense of what it is that I like. I think what I need to avoid though is purchasing any more first books in series until I've got to the other first books in series that I already have on my shelf. Part of me wants to say I want to be a bit more lenient with new releases, because I do want to be a little bit more like on the pulse with new releases and what people are reading when they're reading them, rather than me being behind everybody by 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to land on that, because like, I do want to be reading more new releases and I'm already hesitant to pick up new release books. I think though, as far as like fossicking for new backlist titles to get into, that's something I need to stop until I have read a decent more amount of what is already on my shelf. That wasn't a correct sentence, but you know what I mean. There are several series that have been on my mind that I do really want to try. One example would be the Dandelion Dynasty series by Ken Liu, and I've been wanting to pick that up for months, but I've been resisting that because I know I have so many other series that are ongoing or that I still have yet to start. So I think that's kind of a shift in my mind that I have already started to make, so I'm not as worried about that section, if that makes sense. I feel like the mystery though, I did not have a sense of where I was in terms of my mystery journey. I thought there were more books already on my shelf and I thought I liked more of them already. But there's only one! I still can't get over that. The general fiction, I'm not too worried about. I have not bought a lot of general fiction or literary fiction this year. There are certainly a handful of titles that I've bought this year, some that I've read, but obviously our percentages for that section are a little bit more reasonable and acceptable than the fantasy and mystery. And I just don't think I'm bringing that much new general fiction, literary fiction in at the moment. Manga, I kind of feel like I've already put myself on a little bit of a ban. I haven't bought any new manga in quite a while. I've been tempted, but I have not done it. And I've kind of made it a goal of mine to finish Natsume before I start any more series. And after Natsume, I want to get to Fruits Basket and Full Metal Alchemist because I already have those completed sets and I haven't finished them yet. The non-fiction is another section that I'm not too worried about. I mean, I was quite surprised that I'd read 49% of the books. That does leave 51, obviously, that are currently unread. I feel like non-fiction is something that I don't tend to pick up a lot of books in, unless, like I said, something happens in my life or in the world that I want to learn more about. And although these numbers have been very sobering, and I'm probably going to continue to reflect on them, I think the shelf that is kind of harder to talk about is the children's shelf, because obviously I'm a children's bookseller. So I don't necessarily think of the books that are out there on that shelf, which is what, about 150 of them. I don't necessarily think of them as my books in the same way that I think of this shelf. Like, these are books that I have picked that I want to read. And while a lot of the middle grade and young adult and graphic novel books that I've picked up, I do have an interest in reading. Sometimes that interest is just because I think that I should read it, or I should at least read, you know, a couple of chapters to get a sense of it so that I can hand sell it better, or so that I have more of a reference as a children's bookseller. And then obviously on top of that, a lot of those books are proofs or secondhand that I've been given. So yes, there are books on that shelf that I have paid for, but an awful lot of them I did not pay for. And sometimes I really do just have a little bit of a skim of those books just to get a sense of them. So although I've only read, completed, and kept 39% of the books that are on that shelf, those are the books that I really, really loved. The other 61% includes books, yes, that I picked out for myself that I want to read, but I would say that's a pretty small percentage. I would say most of the unread books on that shelf are proofs that I probably won't even read in their entirety. It's just not physically possible to read as many children's books as I kind of need to keep up with all of the new releases that come in. And indeed, we're not expected to. We are not expected to read all of the books in the shop. So I don't want to go into it too much, but I hope that makes sense why I do have a little bit of a different relationship to the books out there on that shelf, and why I don't necessarily think of them as on my TBR in the same way as I do books here. The number out there doesn't worry me as much as the books in here do, even though, funnily enough, it's the same. 39% read. I'm very consistent. I don't know that I would necessarily describe these numbers as confronting. I suppose they're just illuminating and useful, because I have never gone through all of my books and counted them like this. So it's definitely given me some more perspective and some things to think about. And I do think it will help me be a little bit more considered in the books that I pick up. Now, just as a disclaimer, because I know that it will come up at some point, I already have books on order. There's not a lot, but there's a handful of books that are still coming in. And I think one of them is a mystery book. So if you see a couple of books that added to this in like the near future, especially in the category that we spoke about that I shouldn't be adding books to, then that is why. And although I don't necessarily want to give myself some hard goal of a certain percentage to get to, like by the end of next year or something, I think generally speaking, I just would like to increase the number, the percentage of read books on my shelf by the end of next year. So we're at 39. We are at 39 as of the day that I'm filming this, which is the 9th of December, 2023. So maybe we can have a little bit of a chat at the end of next year about how my TBR is going. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to chat with you in the comments below about TBRs, book collections, and how we approach them. Of course, a big thank you goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thanks so much for watching, hanging out with me, and holding a space of not too much judgment. I'm sure there was a little bit of judgment, but not too much. I will talk to you again soon. Until then, so much love and happy reading. Bye.